please? Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
You be seated and state your full name.
Dr. Locum.
Dr. Locum, would you state briefly your training and experience in the field of pathology?
I attended medical school at Washington University in St. Louis and graduated in 1942. I did a residency in pathology at MD Anderson Hospital in Houston. I joined the Western Laboratories Medical Group of Pathologists in Oakland in 1950 and was board certified in pathology in 1951. I founded the Institute of Forensic Sciences in Oakland in 1954 and was its director until 1968.
How many autopsies have you done, Dr. Locum?
Approximately 10,000.
In 1977, when the House of Representatives of the United States Congress decided to reinvestigate President Kennedy's assassination, were you asked as one of several independent pathologists to serve on a special committee and as special consultants?
Yes, a panel of 9 forensic pathologists from across the country was assembled to evaluate and interpret and reach conclusions about the medical evidence pertaining to the assassination of John Kennedy and the wounding of Governor Connally. 6 of the panel members, including myself, had never seen the evidence before. 3 panel members had seen it and had arrived at opinions which they had publicly expressed.
And was one of the panel members already a well-known critic of the Warren Commission?
Yes, he was.
What was his name?
Dr. Wecht.
All right, Dr. Cyril Wecht.
Dr. Cyril Wecht, yes.
Right. Dr. Locum, what did you do in order, as a member of the panel and independently, in order to reach an opinion as to each of the wounds suffered by President Kennedy and Governor Connally?
The panel reviewed the autopsy report. It reviewed all of the medical records, the x-rays that had been taken, the photographs. It examined the clothing of both individuals. It also interviewed many of the treating physicians and the autopsy surgeons, and also consulted other experts who had expertise that might bear on our evaluation, such as radiologists, anthropologists, that type of thing.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what your examination revealed as to each of the wounds? And I would like you to start with the head wound to President Kennedy, the one caused by the shot that sent the brains and skull matter flying that they've already seen in the photographs.
There was a bullet entrance wound in the right upper back of the head, approximately 1 inch below the, approximately 1 inch to the right of the midline.
Stop for just a second. Could we get the mouse turned on so that she could indicate what she's talking about? I thought it was up there. Could we get that one turned on?
I believe she has one.
Let's try the button. Okay, there it is. Would you point to the entry wound on President Kennedy's head that you just told us about?
Just to the tip of the arrow is a round entrance wound. This is 1 inch to the right of the midline and approximately 4 inches above the external occipital protuberance. This scalp wound showed a braiding of its margins, which is a characteristic of a bullet entrance. The underlying bone of the skull also showed inward beveling. And in order to describe this, when a bullet hits a bone on a flat surface, it makes a round perforation. Then as it passes through the bone, it breaks off many tiny fragments, as you can see in the bottom diagram, causing beveling. This beveling is one of the characteristics of bullets passing through bone. If the beveling is inward, the bullet is going in. If the beveling is outward on the outside, then the bullet is going out.
Could you tell from examining the beveling in the photographs what direction the bullet was going when it passed through the back of President Kennedy's skull, as you just described?
The bullet was going inward.
Okay. So it came from the rear?
Yes, it did. It then passed through the brain, causing extensive laceration of the brain tissue, and exited in the right side front of the head in a very large fractured defect. Several of these fractures could be evaluated, and at least one of them showed an area on the edge of outward beveling, so that the actual exit could be placed at that location.
Dr. Loquim, I'm going to ask you to put that mouse away since it jitters around. And do you have it now facing at the bullet hole that went out?
Yes, I do.
Could you find in the photographs that you examined a place in the skull that indicated that the bullet had passed out of President Kennedy's head at that point?
Yes.
And the entry wound is back here?
The entry wound is at posterior, yes.
And what this diagram shows is the skull within the hair, and these fragments are the fragments that didn't necessarily blow out of there, but came from this hole that was created by the bullet passing through. Is that right?
Yes, this is a diagrammatic representation of the fragmentation.
And is there a diagram? Could we get the diagram on the screen? Do we have a diagram? Exactly. So that's the way that the bullet traveled.
Yes, this shows an arrow from the entrance to the exit.
Could you now tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about the other wound suffered by President Kennedy, the wound to his back and throat?
Yes, there was a bullet entrance to the back. This is just below the ruler that you see in the photograph.
Am I pointing to the hole that indicates the bullet?
Yes, you are. This wound measured about 7 by 4 millimeters, and it also showed a braiding of its margins, again consistent with a bullet entrance. This bullet passed through the soft tissue of the back. It caused a small fracture of the side of T1, and it exited in the front of the neck through a small wound that was originally observed to be only a few millimeters in size. This wound was subsequently enlarged by the insertion of a tracheostomy or breathing tube, and the wound, as you see here, is much enlarged from what the actual exit wound was observed to be.
Could you tell from examining the available evidence which way the bullet that made these two wounds, the wound in the right side of the upper back and the wound in the throat, was traveling? Could you tell whether it's coming this way or from behind?
The wound in the back was clearly an entrance from its characteristics, and also from the clothing, which showed round holes with the fibers of the fabric pointing inward or towards the body. The wound of the neck, examination of the clothing also showed slit-like, consistent with an exit wound, perforations of the band of the shirt just below the button, and also a slit-like defect of the knot of the tie on the left side. This type of clothing over a small exit wound, as it was originally observed, could have, or over an exit wound, could cause it to be buttressed or compressed so that it would remain a small type of wound.
Would that shoring up of the wound lead to the possibility that a surgeon or somebody else examining it would believe it to be an entrance as opposed to an exit wound?
Yes, that would certainly be possible.
In your experience with 10,000 autopsies, is that a mistake that sometimes the surgeons who are trying to save the patient's life make, mistaking an entrance for an exit wound as they're working on the patient?
Yes, they're primarily addressing the problem of saving the patient's life, and their training and experience is along these lines, and so they're not really concerned with which way a bullet is going, only that there is a hole. It is really the experience of the forensic pathologist to evaluate entrance, exit, and those types of injuries.
Other than the clothing and the nature of the wounds, was there anything about x-rays that would indicate the path of this bullet that passed through President Kennedy's back and it came out his throat?
There was observed to be air in the tissue, which could have resulted from the bullet passing through and injuring the trachea. And there was also a very small area of fracturing of the side of a little bone that sticks off thoracic vertebrae number 1. This was undisplaced, so it would be a very small area.
And that's where the arrow already indicates on the x-ray?
Yes, it does.
Dr. Loquim, was President Kennedy's body, including his brain, completely x-rayed to see if any bullets were left in the body?
Yes, it was.
And were they? Did you examine those x-rays, and what did you conclude about that?
No, there were no bullets left in the body.
Would you briefly describe for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury all the wounds suffered by Governor Connally, with particular emphasis on any indication that you had of which way the bullet was going?
Governor Connally sustained an entrance wound of the right side back, as you see in this diagram. The wound was ovoid in shape, measuring approximately 1.5 centimeters by 0.8 centimeters, suggesting that the bullet was not hitting point on, but rather had passed through something else and was hitting at an unusual angle. It then passed through the right side of his chest, fracturing his fifth rib, and exited in the right front chest, just below the nipple. He then had a wound, another ovoid, irregular wound on the back of his right wrist. This wound also was irregular in size and shape. This passed through his wrist, fracturing the radius, and exited on the front. Finally, he had a irregular wound of the inner aspect of the left thigh that only penetrated a short ways into the tissue. It did not pass deeply into the leg, and subsequently fell out of this wound.
Dr. Loquam, was your opinion about the nature of these wounds and what direction the bullet was traveling when it made these wounds shared by all of the other independent pathologists that were retained by the House committee?
Yes, save for Dr. Wecht.
Thanks very much. Nothing further.
All right, thank you. Cross-examination. Do you desire this up, or do you want this one down?
We could have that one, not this one, but the one just before that one. Yes, exactly. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You didn't actually participate in the autopsy or ever examine the physical body of President Kennedy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What your work has been is work from photographs and x-rays and other things that were taken and then shared by members of this panel some years later. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Earlier, the jury was told by the prosecution, I think you may not have been present, about the eminent qualifications of the surgeons that performed the autopsy. Did you know those people?
No, I did not. I subsequently met them.
Did you know them by reputation?
Yes.
And did you believe them to be capable people of performing an important autopsy like this?
They were very capable, qualified pathologists. Their expertise was not, however, in the area of forensic pathology.
Mm-hmm. And sort of going directly to the bottom line, Doctor, do you agree or disagree with the findings of the people that actually looked at the body of the dead president?
I think that the ultimate findings that they made were basically the panel agreed with, that there were 2 shots to the back of President Kennedy, one in the head and one in the neck. But I think some of the other format the panel did disagree with.
And indeed, you were relatively harsh in criticizing those people who did the original autopsy, were you not?
I don't know if we were harsh. We were direct.
Well, when you say there was a lack of proper presentation of the evidence and incompleteness in the autopsy, you did say that, right?
Yes, we did.
And you concluded, based on looking at pictures, that the people who did the autopsy were off by about 4 inches as to where the bullet entered President Kennedy's head, right?
Yes, we disagreed with them in that matter.
And indeed, you disagreed to the point of about 4 inches,
Yes.
right? Now, let me focus on...
Excuse me one second, counsel. That should be removed from the screen.
In what, if I could focus on the so-called magic bullet, and that's a term you're familiar with, is it not, Doctor?
Yes, it is.
And if I could trace with you what, in your understanding, this bullet did, and I think you started to do that a little bit with the prosecution, This was the bullet that first entered President Kennedy's back, correct?
That's correct.
And then passed all the way through the body and came out the front, correct?
In the area of the neck, yes.
Yes, in the area of the neck. And did it change direction at all while it was inside of President Kennedy, as you understand it?
No.
And then it went straight into Governor Connally by his back.
It went into his back, yes.
And came out his front or side,
His chest, yes.
and then through his wrist,
That's correct.
and then into his leg.
Yes.
And did you ever examine the bullet that supposedly did all this?
Yes, the panel did.
And did you notice any substantial distortions in that bullet?
There was some flattening of the bullet, yes.
Some flattening of the bullet. We'll go into with ballistic experts exactly what this bullet looks like, and we'll have pictures for the jury. But so that the jury will have in their mind your testimony about this flattening. How much was it flattened as you saw this bullet, Doctor?
It was flattened, I think, without showing it. I can't describe it
Was
as...
it flattened very much?
No, not very much.
Right. Now, you said that this bullet fell out. Remember telling the jury that?
Yes, I did.
You don't really know what happened to that bullet, do you?
Well, based on the information and the evidence that where the bullet was subsequently found, we did conclude that it had fallen out of the wound in Governor Connally's leg.
Where was the bullet found, Doctor?
I believe it was found on the gurney on which he had been laying before he went to the operating room.
It was found on a stretcher in the hospital, right?
That's correct.
It was found a long time after Governor Connally had been removed from that stretcher, correct?
I don't know how long it was.
You don't know how long.
I don't recall.
It was found not by the police. It was found by somebody at the hospital, right?
That's
They saw this
right.
bullet lying on that stretcher. And you don't have any information as to how, any personal knowledge as to how this bullet got to be on that stretcher, do you, Doctor?
As I indicated, by the information available and the examination that we did, we concluded that that was the bullet from his leg.
Well, I want to be very clear about this. Did you really conclude that that was the bullet from his leg? Was there any way to trace that bullet to all those wounds?
Well, the summation of the information made it probable that
Did you say possible or probable?
that bullet had passed through all of the places I've outlined and ended up there.
Well, wait a minute, Doctor. That bullet didn't leave any traces when it went through, did it?
It actually did. It left some metal in Governor Connally's wrist.
You're not suggesting that you have traced that metal on the bullet from Governor Connally's wrist to that bullet, have you? You didn't do that, did you?
Excuse me, I haven't, no.
No. And have you ever talked to anybody that purported to have done that?
I think some studies were done on it.
Did you ever talk to anybody that purported to do that even?
I don't recall.
Let me focus on Governor Connally's wrist. You have seen pictures, home movies that were taken of the assassination, correct?
Are you referring to something specific or?
Yes. You've seen a film of the assassination, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And you've seen a picture of Governor Connally holding a hat, right?
Yes, I have.
And you believe that Governor Connally was holding that hat after you believe that the bullet had passed through his wrist, right?
I think it's possible that he still had the hat in his hand.
Well, you say it's possible. You have concluded that after the time that you believe the bullet had passed through his hand, because you believe it's the same bullet that came in through President Kennedy's back, after that time, Governor Connally's still holding the hat. You've seen him hold the hat after you think he's been shot, right?
Yes.
Were you able to tell from examining Governor Connally's wrist or the pictures of it what nerves that bullet severed in his wrist when it went through?
No, I didn't observe that. I think it was noted by the treating physicians
That what?
that there was injury to nerves and tendons in that area.
Nerves and tendons that would be necessary to hold somebody fast, doctor?
That would help, yes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. You're excused. You may step down. Your next witness.
We're going to take a break now for a few moments
Dr.
with
Martin Fackler, Your Honor.
coverage of the mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. So stay with us. Of the mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald taking place in San Francisco as part of the American Bar Association's annual convention. On the witness stand, as we broke away, Dr. Martin Fackler, who, rather than being an actor, as most of the witnesses are, as we've indicated to you, is indeed a forensic expert. And he's testifying now about his findings and opinions concerning the bullet that entered the body of President Kennedy. Let's go back into this courtroom now in the mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald and listen to this testimony.
You expect in Governor Connolly's back, would it be a nice little round hole or would it be an oblong hole?
No, it would have to be an oblong hole.
All right. And what happened to the bullet after it entered Governor Connolly, in your opinion?
After it entered Governor Connolly, it passed through some subcutaneous tissue and muscle, and then it impacted a rib and destroyed about 10 centimeters, that's 4 inches of rib. Now, in order to destroy that much rib, in my opinion, it would almost certainly have to be going practically sideways, because the bullet going point forward presents such a small diameter, it would be unlikely to hit the rib. But the bullet is a very long bullet. It's a bullet that was 1.25 inches long. And going sideways, I have the bullet here in my pocket, going sideways, as you can see, impacting a rib, it could sweep right by a rib and easily take out 4 inches.
At that speed, taking out that much rib, what damage would you expect to the Mannlicher Carcano bullet?
I would expect it to be flattened somewhat in the side because it's going sideways and impacting something from the side. So therefore, it would be squeezed from the side, much like if you would squeeze it in a vise.
After striking the rib, where did the bullet go?
The bullet then passed through the muscle and subcutaneous tissues and came out the skin of the front of Governor Connolly just below the nipple.
Was the wound below Governor Connolly's nipple consistent with a bullet that was flying sideways?
Yes, it was, because it was a large stellate type wound, a blown out type wound. And when a bullet is going sideways through tissue, it flings the tissue aside and causes a large wound as described.
How fast was the bullet going, in your opinion, when it came out of Governor Connolly, having struck the rib?
After it was coming out, I would estimate that it was probably traveling about 900 feet per second.
And the bullet traveling 900 feet per second, was it still tumbling?
Yes, it was.
What did it strike next?
It struck the wrist of Governor Connolly.
What sort of hole would you expect it to make? A little round hole as if it were going straight, or an oblong hole?
No, again, you'd have to have it make an oblong hole if it's going sideways.
Could a bullet going 900 feet per second, entering on its side, making an oblong hole, fracture Governor Connolly's wrist?
Oh, certainly.
Have you done any experiments to indicate what would happen to the bullet going at approximately a similar bullet at approximately that speed going through a wrist?
Yes, we have. Several weeks ago, we shot the Carcano bullet at a lowered velocity. We obtained this velocity by experimenting with powder charges and determined the powder charge with which we could get the lowered velocity, and shot this directly into a cadaver wrist.
Do we have an X-ray of the cadaver wrist that this bullet at this lower velocity?
It's on the screen right now.
And that shows the hole that it made. Is that more or less damage than the actual bullet made in Governor Connolly's wrist, based on other X-rays that you've seen?
And that's somewhat more damage because our bullet was going 200 feet per second faster. It was about 1,100 feet per second, the one we shot.
Could we see what happened to your bullet making this much damage going at 1,100 feet per second, smashing through that wrist? First of all, tell the jury, did anything happen to the bullet?
The bullet was non-deformed, not at all, not flattened in the least. And here's the bullet on longitudinal view, and I think now we have one. There's the end view, and you can see there's not the amount of flattening that the so-called pristine bullet shows.
Dr. Fackler, very briefly, because we're running out of time, what speed was it coming when was the bullet going when it came out of the wrist, in your opinion?
Probably about 400 feet per second.
At that speed, would there be enough power to go in and break bone in the leg?
No, there would not.
And is the wound to Governor Connolly consistent with a bullet going at that low speed, 400
Entirely
feet?
consistent.
Would it cause any damage to go to the bullet to go in at that speed?
Unlikely to cause any damage to the bullet.
Have you had an opportunity to examine photographs of Exhibit 399 to the Warren Commission, which is this bullet that was found on Governor Connolly's stretcher that went through President Kennedy and Governor Connolly?
Yes, I have.
And did you observe the damage to that bullet, the flattening that has
The
been
flattening, I did observe that.
What was the damage to Exhibit 399 consistent with what you would expect to happen to a bullet that goes through President Kennedy's back and through Governor Connolly as you've described?
It was entirely consistent.
All right. A couple of other questions. As an expert in the field of wound ballistics, do you know who the other experts in that field are?
Well, yes, pretty much. My last 10 years of my military career was spent as an expert in the field, running a laboratory in this. I'm very familiar with the world literature on the
Is Dr.
subject.
Cyril Wecht an expert in the field of wound ballistics?
Well, the only yardstick subjective that I could have to judge this is the contribution of positive articles to the world literature on wound ballistics, and I have seen none.
Okay. Dr. Wecht and possibly another expert for the defense have opined that President Kennedy's head wound could have been caused by something called a frangible bullet fired from the front. Do you have an opinion about that as a possibility in this case?
Yes, I do. In view of the very solid physical evidence in this case, I find that absurd.
Okay. Finally, there is a question in this case about the fact that there were 4 cartridges of one manufacturer which were identified as coming from Oswald's gun, having been fired from the Smith & Wesson that killed when Officer Tippit was killed. And then there are 4 bullets, one of which doesn't match up in terms of the same manufacturer with one of the cartridges. Is there anything unusual about that?
Not at all. The explanation is that these were what we call reloads. And what a reload is the most expensive part of a cartridge is the brass casing. And therefore, to save money, you can take this brass casing and reuse it. You must resize it, clean it, put a new primer in, and use it again. If you go down to any major gun store and ask for a 38 special bullets, box of bullets, they will give you a box of Winchester or Remingtons, and they'll be rather expensive. Now, if you know weapons well, you will ask them, do you have any reloads? And they say, well, we do, and they'll cost you less than half as much. So the reason for reloads is that they're much more economical, and someone who understands weapons would naturally use reloads.
Nothing further. Thank you, Dr. Fackler.
Thank you. Thank you. Cross-examination.
Thank you. Doctor, I want to be sure I understand something. Is it on now?
Yes?
Yep. Dr. Fackler, I want to be sure that I heard you correctly. The bullet that you say went through the president's back, out his throat, you say began to tumble, hit the governor in his back, went through his chest, fractured his rib, came out below the right nipple, then went into his wrist, fractured his wrist, and then landed in his left thigh. That, in your words, is an absolutely typical trajectory for that bullet. Is that your testimony, sir?
It certainly is.
All right. Now, you say that that bullet, in your view, was tumbling when it left the president's neck, throat, on its way to the governor's back. Is that correct?
It had just begun to tumble. I would guess the degree of yaw probably would have been no more than 5 to 10 degrees.
But you characterize that as tumbling. Is that right?
Well, it's the beginning of tumbling, certainly.
Would you characterize the wound in the back of Governor Connolly, which, by the way, you never saw that wound, did you?
I won't know. I've never seen the wound.
All right. Would you characterize the wound based on your after-the-fact examination of evidence concerning the wound as a puncture-type wound?
No.
Now, you're aware, are you not, that Dr. Connolly was attended on November 22, 1963 by the chief thoracic surgeon at Parkland Hospital, whose name was Dr. Robert Shaw?
Yes, I read the operation report by Dr. Shaw.
And you're aware, aren't you, Doctor, that Dr. Shaw has told the House Select Committee investigating the assassination of the president that the wound was not caused by a tumbling bullet. That is, the wound to the back of the governor. Isn't that so?
The operation report of Dr. Shaw indicates a wound that was 3 centimeters long, which is entirely consistent with this bullet traveling sideways.
Well, let me read to you from the report, Doctor, because your recollection may be flawed. It says the wound was actually approximately 1.5 centimeters long. The ragged edges of the wound were surgically cut away, effectively enlarging it to approximately 3 centimeters. Isn't that what he told the commission, sir?
The 1.5 centimeters, I recognize that later on he changed his recollection to 1.5 centimeters.
Is that what he told the House Select Committee, Doctor?
I'm not aware. I don't think I've read the particular document you have in
All right,
hand.
let me, if I may, Your Honor, let me show you this. This is the report of the interview of Dr. Robert Shaw for the House Select Committee on the assassination, 1977. I will give counsel a copy.
Your Honor, I think we're confusing the difference between the committee and the Warren Commission, but if Dave wants to spend time on it, it's all right with me.
Now, Doctor, you have that document?
Again, we might just proceed with question, answers, or very concise objections, okay?
Doctor, did Dr. Shaw tell the House Select Committee investigators that the wound was a puncture-type wound? And I'm referring to the bottom of the first page.
He says it was a puncture-type wound.
Did he say that it was 1.5 centimeters and that he increased it to approximately 3 centimeters by surgically cutting it at the top of the next page?
He says the bullet had struck the body at a slight declination, and the wound was actually approximately 1.5 centimeters.
Thank you. Does he say further down the next page, and I quote, "It is Dr. Shaw's opinion that the wound was not caused by a tumbling bullet, an inference drawn explicitly from his belief that a tumbling bullet would not have had sufficient force to cause the remainder of the governor's wounds." Did he say that?
Yes, he says that.
Did he also say that he believed that the bullet which hit the governor had not struck any other objects? Does he say that as well?
He says that.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you very much. You're excused, Doctor. Thank you. We call your next witness.
Your Honor, we would call Dr. Robert Pizziali. Is our
Raise
next
your right hand,
witness.
please. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
You be seated and state your full name, please.
It's Robert Louis Pizziali.
Dr. Pizziali,
I note for you that Dr.
First of all-
Pizziali is not an actor. He is indeed who he is going to express himself as, a real figure in this area, testifying in this trial.
Mechanics and mechanical engineering.
Yes, I have a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley.
Doesn't mean you have to talk as fast as I talk. Make sure they understand.
Okay. And then I was on the faculty at Stanford University for 14 years, where I taught mechanical engineering and did research work in the area of biomechanics. That really has to do with the motions of people and how people are injured. And since that time, I have numerous publications and experience in the area of recreating events and analyzing injuries.
Were you asked by the government of the United States for this trial to determine the number of shots and the location of the shooter of those shots for the events of President Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963?
Yes.
Would you tell the jury very briefly what methods you used in order to carry out that task?
Yes, I studied the Zapruder film very thoroughly, looked at all the physical evidence that was available, read the witness testimony, reviewed the work of Drs. Locum and Fackler, conducted various tests and analysis, and then prepared for my testimony today various exhibit and animation material to help explain to the jury how those conclusions were reached.
What are your conclusions as to the number of shots and the location of the shooters that day, Mr. Pizziali, first in general?
It's my belief that there were 3 shots that day, and that they all came from the southeast corner window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository.
Would you show the jury what you did, simply, if it's all right with the court, narrate for them what you did and move through the exhibits to show them your analysis of each one of these three shots. Go ahead.
Yes, here's first the Zapruder film. Now, that film as it was somewhat difficult to analyze, so what we did was to do it in slow motion and to zoom in some on the car so we could see things a little bit more clearly.
You might slow down just a little bit and perhaps keep your voice up.
Okay. Here you can see the president waving, and he and Governor Connolly heading behind the sign. The little flash here is there are a few frames missing, but they've been accounted for. Now they're emerging from the sign. There's evidence that they have been shot at this point. The car will continue down the road. You can see them reacting to their wounds. And then very quickly here we'll have the fatal shot to the president's head. The next thing that I did was to look for other physical evidence. The other physical evidence consisted of the scene on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. This is generally referred to as the sniper's nest. You can see that boxes have been lined up so somebody could be on the other side of those without being observed by someone in the room. And behind that sniper's nest there were found 3 cartridges that were identified as being fired from the Mannlicher Carcano rifle owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. From that then we were able to look at what Lee Harvey Oswald would have seen from that position as the car moved down through Dealey Plaza. This was done by the FBI, where they mounted a camera onto the scope of the gun. And you can see there's about where the second shot would have been fired, and in this area here somewhere the third shot would be fired. So you could see the advantage that the vantage point he had. Then what I did was to analyze each individual shot. The first shot, there's very little evidence for the first shot. Governor Connolly said that he heard a shot and turned to the right. Here at frame about 166, we see the governor sort of starting to turn to the right. And if we continue on with this a little further, you can see he turns a little more to the right. He's kind of behind the overhead structure on the presidential limousine. But anyway, before he goes to the sign, he's turned to the right. And later we'll see that even after out of the sign, he's still turned to the right. So his reaction to the sound that he thought was a bullet, a rifle shot, was somewhere in that time frame. Now, unfortunately, there's no physical evidence of that, where that bullet was. The question is, what happened to it? First, there's several people thought that the first shot sounded funny. Some people thought it sounded like a rifle, but some people thought it sounded like a firecracker or a misfire to a rifle. In addition, if you look at the view from the scope produced by the FBI, in this area there are things that the bullet could have been deflected off of. This is actually a structure that supports a stop light, and a little further on you'll see that the president goes behind trees. So we don't know exactly what happened with that bullet, but there is a funny sound and there is the opportunity for deflection. The second shot, however, we have some evidence, and as you've heard, I believe that a single bullet created the wounds to the president and the governor. In order for that to be true, we have to, number one, show that obviously they were hit at the same time. Secondly, we have to show that the trajectory that a bullet would travel is consistent with passing through the wounds on the president and the governor. Third, we have to show that the injuries are consistent with how a bullet would react to going through 2 people. And lastly, we have to show that the damage to the bullet is consistent with having produced the injuries. Okay, those are the 4 things that we'll be discussing.
You might again slow down a bit and perhaps keep your voice up towards the end of the sentences.
Okay. First of all, let's take a look at the Zapruder film, and we're going to be...
Now, what we're talking about is the second shot.
Now we're going to go towards the second shot. The first shot was fired sometime before, I believe, that frame there, 166, up to 166. Now, the second shot occurs about 3 seconds later, and I'll show you the basis for that. If we look at the governor right here, you can see his tie, and you can see that his lapel is open widely. If we go to the next frame here, what I'll do is outline that lapel. Now watch the sudden motion in one frame. There's tremendous motion of his right lapel. Remember, the bullet goes through his right chest, enters under his right nipple. You can see the effect of the bullet going through his jacket. So there's definitive evidence At frame 224, that's when the bullet passed through the body of Governor Connally. Now, if we take a look at President Kennedy, the question is, when did he receive his wound? I'm sorry, here we'll just look at the governor reacting to that wound. You can see that there's continuing evidence of him being shot. If we now go on to look at President Kennedy from before the sign, notice the arm, notice that he's waving to the crowd, his hand is up around his face, his elbow slightly elevated off the side of the car, you can see it right there. As he continues behind the sign, you'll see his hand is still up by his face. As he emerges from the sign, you'll see that his hand is in a down position. As he was waving, he's now bringing it down. You can see that's his right hand right there. If we go to the next frame, you'll actually notice that the hand drops slightly. If we go back and forth, see the shiny part of the back seat of the car, you'll see his hand is actually still coming down from the wave. He has not yet reacted to the bullet that's gone through his body. If we now move on, what we'll see is that in the next frame, there's his arm at this frame I was talking about. Now, watch it again. The elbow still hasn't jerked. Now the elbow jerks up. Okay, so it's a few frames later where you actually watch the elbow pop up. That is the president's first sign of reaction to being shot. Now, if we move forward to look at where his arms and hands finally end up, okay, now so that's about 200 milliseconds after the governor's shot. Now look where his hands are, look where his elbows are. He's not reaching for his throat, as has been commonly said. If you look, he has his left fist against his chin, right fist against his chin, his left fist against that, and his elbows up in the air. That's not grabbing for his chest. What it is, it's a known reflex reaction to spinal cord shock at the base of the neck. The bullet has just passed near the base of his neck. The shock from the bullet causes spinal cord shock and forces this reflexive reaction of the president. That reflexive reaction takes approximately 200 milliseconds, which is exactly the time from when the bullet passes through Governor Connally's lapel, and we see the first motion of the president's elbow. Consequently, through our engineering animation, we have a physically correct and a visually correct representation of Dealey Plaza. The next thing we did is we made a model of the car. The model of the car was based on dimensions that appear in the literature, plus we sent one of our staff to actually look at the limousine. We recreated the limousine, and now we can actually move the limousine through Dealey Plaza. But the only really important part of where this limousine is and where the people are is at the time the shots are fired. And the way we do that is by using reverse projection. And this is a technique that allows us to place the president and the governor where they are at the time they were shot. We made a physical model of the car, which is the scale. What you'll see is the animation has put the governor and the president in the exact same position they were in Dealey Plaza in 1963.
What we did then is accurately went back and measured the location of the wounds on the president and the governor. You can see here where we're taking these measurements. These then get entered into the animation, and what we can do then is say, well, given those wounds, where does the shooter have to be? Where is the sniper that makes this shot? We drew a straight line through the president's back wound and the governor's chest wound. What we found is, given the slight inaccuracies of wound location and car position,
on cross-examination about whether or not, I think of Dr. Lopeland, the pathologist, was there any evidence that the wound to Governor Connolly's wrist was caused by the bullet that's known as Exhibit 399? Do you know of any such evidence?
yes, I do.
What is it?
In the late 1970s, Dr. Wynn from the University of California, Irvine did a neutron activation study. experiment.
Excuse me, where are you aiming? Are you attempting to hit the entry wound?
We are attempting to hit the exact entry wound of the president. We laid that geometrically. Required to shoot 10 shots in 1 minute. That also includes the magazine change, okay?
Testimony.
Yes, I believe that the evidence shows that there were 3 shots fired from the southeast corner. Went to his throat, then I think it's very clear that in fact he would not be reaching for his throat.